The scripture reading today comes from 1 Samuel chapter 17, and it's a very long chapter. But for today's lectionary reading, uh, it is selected verses, and Clyde and I will. And this is the story of David fighting Goliath.
Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armored with a coat of mail. The weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. He had greaves of bronze on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. And his shield bearer went before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel,
"Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you are not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourself, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us."
And the Philistines said,
"Today I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man that we may fight together."
When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. David rose early in the morning, left someone in charge of the sheep, took the provisions, and went as Jesse had commanded him. He came to the encampment as the army was going forth to the battle line, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage, ran to the ranks, and went and greeted his brothers. As he talked with them, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up and out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before. And David heard him. David said to Saul,
"Let no one's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine."
Saul said to David,
You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are just a boy, and he has been a warrior from his youth."
But David said to Saul,
"Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and whenever a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock, I went after it and struck it down, rescuing the lamb from its mouth. And if it turned against me, I would catch it by the jaw, strike it down, and kill it. Your servant has killed both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, since he has defied the armies of the living God."
David said,
"The Lord who saved me from the paws of the lion and from the paw of the bear will save me from the hand of this Philistine."
So Saul said to David,
"Go, and may the Lord be with you."
Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a bronze helmet on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. David strapped Saul's sword over the armor, and he tried in vain to walk, for he was not used to them. Then David said to Saul,
"I cannot walk with these, for I am not used to them."
So David removed them. Then he took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the water, and he put them in his shepherd's bag, in the pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. The Philistine came on and drew near to David, with his shield bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. The Philistine said to David,
"Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?"
and the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David,
"Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the field."
But David said to the Philistine,
"You come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This very day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head, and I will give the dead bodies of the Philistine army this very day to the birds of the air and to the wild animals of the earth, so that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not save by sword and spear. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand."
When the Philistine drew nearer to meet David, David ran quickly towards the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone, slung it, and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground.
An archaeologist found a burial ground in Israel, and he immediately declared that the cause of death was through a heart attack. All of his colleagues looked at him in disbelief, as to say, "How can you even know that?" Then he showed a small clay tablet that said 10 pieces of silver, David over Goliath, 5,000 to 1 odds. One of the most fascinating stories in all of the Bible is the story of David and Goliath. I heard it with excitement when I was in primary school in Korea. When I was serving as a chaplain for the Scouts, one evening I was invited to provide religious training at Alex Muir Public School. I had the children dramatize the David and Goliath story, and the children had so much fun with it. The story carries rich theological and social significance. In the second half of the 11th century, before the Common Era, Philistines were making their way into Israel, ready to conquer the land. They were battle-tested and dangerous. Philistines set up camp along the southern ridge of the Elah Valley. Israel set camp on the other side of the valley on the north. This left the armies in a stalemate as they looked at each other across the valley. Neither dared to attack, because in order to do so, one had to go down the valley, and then they had to fight literally an uphill battle, which is basically suicidal. So the Philistines sent their greatest and most fearsome warrior to settle the matter one-on-one. Goliath was a giant, 6'9" at least, wearing a bronze helmet and full body armor. He carried a javelin, a spear, and a sword. He was a menacing presence. He was taunting Israel to send their best into one-to-one combat. This was a common practice in the ancient world. Two sides in a conflict would seek to avoid heavy losses by choosing one warrior from each side to settle the matter. This was what Goliath was seeking. But no one in Israel dared to go up against this giant, which was totally understandable. Young David happened to show up at the battlefield simply because his older brothers were fighting in King Saul's army. David's father Jesse sent his youngest son to the battle, in order to deliver some home-cooked meals for his older brothers. As David went to see his older brothers, he heard something he did not like. He heard Goliath taunting Israel, and their soldiers fled in fear. This happened on a daily basis for a long time. I am sure Goliath enjoyed the daily ritual of insulting Israel's army and seeing them shiver in fear. David, a mere teenager, wanted to fight the not-so-friendly giant. When the young teenage David finally showed up to battle Goliath, he was insulted for being an unworthy opponent. Battle-hardened mountain of a man named Goliath vowed to feed David's flesh to the birds and wild animals. This was truly a fear-inducing pre-match trash talking. There are all kinds of David and Goliath type of scenarios in our world. Usually they are referred to in lopsided sporting matches, though the terminology is not that used that much as a metaphor can get overused. And secondly, a lot of people do not know the Bible anymore. Yet when it comes to battles to eradicate racism, climate change, and justice for Aboriginal people, it really does look like David versus Goliath battle. In many ways, these seem like fighting a losing battle against formidable opponents who like to maintain the status quo, who like to keep their power and money at all costs. So how do we fight the good fight? We do not use our strength alone. Let us listen to what David said to King Saul to convince him that he was worthy enough to fight. David said, "The Lord who saved me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will save me from the hand of this Philistine." Then David delivered one of the most memorable lines in the Old Testament. He said to Goliath, "You come to me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." No, we may not win too many battles with our own powers alone, but with God's help, we can do things that are daunting, challenging, and even unfathomable. Essentially, Goliath was prepared for a sword fight. On the other hand, David brought a slingshot that he used to fight back lions and bears, which shows incredible courage and skill. Furthermore, slingshot used by David is a little different from our slingshot. In the Middle East, they use a leather pouch attached on two sides by a long strand of rope. They would put a rock in the pouch, swing it around in increasingly wider and faster circles, and then release one end of the rope, hurling the rock forward. Ancient armies have used slingers in battles. In other words, David brought a gun to a knife fight. Guess who really had the advantage? We tend to give David no chance of success, but in reality, David was an overwhelming favorite. Canadian author Malcolm Gladwell wrote a best-selling book about all the little Davids who have overcome Goliath in many different endeavors and fields. Gladwell told stories about different individuals who were able to overcome huge odds by changing the nature of the challenge, by bringing a different skill set that has never been thought of before, which brought them unimagined successes. Ultimately, however, this story is about God. This story is about how God had inspired and worked in a young teenager to bring down the arrogant and powerful. When I saw the statue of David carved out by Michelangelo in the Uffizi Museum in Florence, Italy, I was impressed by its magnificence, standing 5 meters tall. For David's pose, as the tour guide explained, Michelangelo chose the moment right after David had slain Goliath. When we look at closely at David's face, we will see that David is not celebrating like the soccer players after scoring a goal in the Euro 2020. David does not have the look of a triumphant hero. He is not celebrating. Rather, he looks very humble. Michelangelo was portraying David, who felt as though it was not he, but the mighty power of God who had slain Goliath through him. It was a very sacred moment, and David knew it. Though Malcolm Gladwell focused on David's skill as a slinger in defeating the giant, there is, however, much more important component. It is the power of faith that allowed David to have courage. There was the faith that he was going to battle with the power of God. It is with deep trust that he was God's instrument to do what was right in the eyes of God. Lately, the Davids of this world are winning some of the battles against Goliath. The issue of racism took a huge turn when people saw George Floyd murdered by a police officer putting a knee in Floyd's neck. So many people were absolutely horrified to see such racism in action. Here in Canada, we also had a George Floyd moment with the discovery of 215 children's body in an unmarked grave at the Native Residential School in Kamloops, BC. People were also horrified at the recent murders of the Muslim family in London, Ontario. What made these moments truly powerful was that they acted as mirrors, which allowed us to see clearly what we really do not want to see or acknowledge. It made us pause and reflect. Many Canadians are quietly saying to ourselves, we do not want to live in this kind of country. We want to be better than we are, and certainly better than what we have been. The hope and affirmation are that when we are working to mend the fractured world, to heal the broken hearts, to bring down the tyrants from their lofty thrones, and to uplift the lowly and marginalized, then we are participating in God's work. When we do God's work, we do not do them with our strength alone, but by the power of the living God, just like David. When enough people draw such strength together, it changes the world. That is the mission of the church. We are in the business of doing God's work in the world. We believe that we are called to a higher purpose than living a life of ease and comfort. We believe that there's much more meaning and purpose in following Christ's way. We believe that such life is worthy of eternity. It may feel like the odds of success are insurmountable, but in reality, we have all the advantage because God is with us. We are not alone. Thanks be to God.